Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Autumn and today is going to be a bookish video while I do some house cleaning. I have 12 books I want to talk about with you guys today, as well as 3 DNFs. The first book I want to talk to you guys about is The Ballerinas by Rachel Kapulki Dale. I read this book back in April, I believe, so it's been a pretty long time since I read this book. The book synopsis says, 13 years ago, Delphine Lager abandoned her prestigious soloist spot at the Paris Opera Ballet for a new life in St. Petersburg, taking with her a secret that could upend the lives of her best friends, fellow dancers Lindsay and Margot. Now, 36 years old, Delphine has returned to her formal home in the legendary Paris Garnier Opera House to choreograph the ballet that will kickstart the next phase in her career, and she hopes to finally make things right with her formal friends. But Delphine quickly realizes that things have changed since she's been away, and some secrets can't stay buried forever. This book I ended up giving 2 stars, mainly because it just was not what I was expecting. I believe it was pitched as a thriller or, some type of suspense. For me personally, it just did not feel suspenseful. I just didn't really understand a lot of the things that were going on in this story. I thought that this book was going to be a lot more about ballerinas, a lot more about what it meant to be a ballerina, being on point shoes, and then what the type of attitudes and stigma that revolved around being a ballerina and what all it took. I used to dance on point shoes. While I would not say I was an expert in any way, shape, or form, I thought I was going to be able to connect a lot more with these characters, and a lot of the things that they did and a lot of the things that they were learning during this time. I feel like I could have really resonated with those certain situations that were going on, how they were trying to be pinned against each other and trying to be better than the next person. And I'll be totally honest, I didn't. A lot of these things fell flat, and a lot of the twists and turns in the story I found very predictable, found very not as twisty and turny as I think the author was expecting them to be. I think overall I went in with too high of expectations. Instead of just enjoying this book for what it was, I just did not really care for it for those few reasons. I was just bored. I think this book almost put me into a reading slump. I finished it, but that's why I think I went in to the next book, which I'm about to introduce, with a little bit lower expectations, but I just really wanted a good palate cleanser and a book that I thought I knew I was going to enjoy very much, which leads me into my next book, which is The Teacher by Frida McFadden. Now, this was the first Frida McFadden book I had ever read. One of my friends actually recommended this book to me. I have the ebook and I also listened to the audiobook. Most of my experience with this book was through audio. This was the first Frida McFadden book that I had ever read, and I will definitely be reading more from this author. I think the audiobook for this was absolutely perfect. The synopsis of this book says, lesson number 1, trust no one. Eve has a good life. She gets up each day, gets a kiss from her husband, Nate, and heads off to teach math at the local high school. All is as it should be, except last year, heyy was rocked by a scandal with one student, Addie, at its center, and this year, Eve is dismayed to find this girl in her class. Addie can't be trusted. She lies, she hurts people, she destroys lives. At least that's what everyone says. But nobody knows the real Addie. Nobody knows the secrets that could destroy her, and Addie will do anything to keep it secret. I will honestly say that this story did have a lot of twists and turns, and I really enjoyed this story. I loved the perspectives that we got in this story, and at the certain points in the story that we got these perspectives. I won't spoil anything, but I love how the story first opens up. I believe it's the prologue. I don't even think it's chapter 1. I literally think it's the prologue, and that prologue just pulled me right in. I gave it 5 stars. I still think about this book to this day, and I think about how clever this author was with her twists and turns, how she made certain things work, even though, it could be a little controversial. I would definitely look up the trigger warnings for this book too. While I'm not going to spoil anything in this book, I should have expected a certain dynamic to happen between two characters. It was a little bit of a shock to me. It didn't prevent me from enjoying this story, but that is definitely something I would recommend you looking at just in case you are sensitive to certain types of dynamics. This is gonna sound really crazy coming off of my last statement. I actually recommended this book to my mom, and she was able to get the audiobook for this through the Libby app too, and she listened to it and she thought it was a really great book too, and she enjoyed it. Take that as you will. These next two books I'll talk about a little bit quickly, mainly because they're memoirs, and I don't feel comfortable rating memoirs because there's somebody else's life and there's somebody else's experiences. Some of the times the people who are sharing their memoirs, it's a very vulnerable part of their life, or there are certain parts of their life that are extremely vulnerable. I just can't in my heart rate these two books, but the two books I want to talk about is The Woman in Me by Britney Spears and Page Boy by Elliot Page. I absolutely loved these two memoirs, and truly I think that these are two books that everybody should read. I think that they both share really interesting perspectives onto celebrities. I think both of their stories are heartbreaking, but I think that both of these two people are finally free, or they're finally overcoming the obstacles that they faced through their lives. I feel like it's abnormally bright behind me. The next book I want to talk to you guys about is actually a library book. It is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. So this book was an absolute hoot. I had so much fun with this book. It was my first cozy fantasy story, and I really do believe what everybody says about this book, with it kind of being the staple or the beginning of the cozy fantasy era. I can't believe it took me this long to actually read this book. So this book follows our main character Viv. She is an orc barbarian who cashes out her life of a warrior with one final score. A forgotten legend, a fabled artifact, and an unreasonable amount of hope led her to the streets of Thune, where she plans to open the first coffee shop the city has ever seen. However, her dreams of a fresh start, pulling shots instead of swinging swords, are hardly a sure bet. Old frenemies and Thune's shady underbelly may just upset her plans. To finally build something that will last, Viv will need some new partners and a different kind of resolve. Loved it. All of the characters were so fleshed out. I really enjoyed the dynamic between Viv and all of our little kooky characters that we met along the way. And when I first went into this book, I was expecting it to be more just people in fantasy. I wasn't expecting there to be dwarves or any other type of mythical creature. I just was not expecting it, and I was pleasantly surprised. I thought this book was so well written, and you could just tell that Travis Baldree had so much fun writing this story. So I haven't read Bookshops and Bone Dust yet. I really want to. It's the prequel to this book, even though it came afterwards. I have hopes of reading that book because I very much enjoyed this story. Travis Baldree is an audiobook narrator, and then he was his own audiobook narrator. I thought that was just so cool, so fun, and I was really happy that I was able to read this book. I think one of the most relatable parts in this story was Viv and her chronic back pain. I could relate to that. I just think that that was a really fun idea that the author threw into this story. So the next books on this list, I am just going to talk about all three of them and talk about them fairly quickly. I have hopes of making a reading vlog out of these three books plus one other book. For now, I am just going to briefly mention that I reread The Hunger Games Games, Catching Fire, and Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins. I primarily listened to the audiobook for all three of these books. And let me just say, that was my first time listening to those three books on audio, and I think the audiobook is absolutely phenomenal. I read The Hunger Games when it originally came out. Over the last 3 years, I have read them at least 2 more times, and I think this was my third. I very much enjoy The Hunger Games. It is probably one of my most favorite series of all time. I just really wanted to reread the series, and I think what kicked it all off was when we got the announcement for Sunrise at the Reaping, which is going to be the new book that the same author wrote in the same world of Panem, which is going to be coming out in March of 2025. I don't feel like I really need to give you guys my star rating for all three of the books in the Hunger Games trilogy, but if you're curious, they are all 5 stars. They will all, always and forever, be 5 stars for me. I absolutely love that series to pieces, and I just don't ever feel like that love will go away. So the next book on this list is You Shouldn't Have Come Here by Geneva Rose. This book was unhinged, wild, and not what I was expecting. So our main character, what was her name? Chloe? Grace. So our main character, Grace, every year she takes a week off of work, goes on vacation somewhere, and how she determines where she's gonna go on vacation is in her house. She has a map of the United States, and she'll throw a dart at the map, and wherever it lands, that's where she goes. That's what she did this time. She threw a dart in a very small town in Wyoming with near to nothing around. She books an Airbnb on this little ranch, drives out to it. The owner of the Airbnb is there. He is living there, and he basically tells Miss Grace that he is gonna be there, he's gonna be taking care of her, fulfilling all the needs that she has. Grace is like, this is a little weird, but okay, question mark. The story is dual POV. We get Grace's perspective as well as the owner, Calvin, his perspective as well. The more we get involved into the story, the more different it becomes. I read this book, the physical copy, but I also listened to the audiobook. It is dual narrator, and I think those audiobook narrators absolutely killed it. They did so good. But the writing style in this book was a little different. I still gave it 4 stars, even though the sentences I felt like were a little oddly structured at parts. I wish I had marked a few of the sentences. There was just some of the language that was a little odd to me, but it didn't really affect my reading experience. I also think it could have been because the audiobook did a lot better job of kind of smoothing over maybe those rougher parts and, you know, the writing style. But overall, I mean, I would recommend this to anybody who just wants to go into a book that is kind of like low stakes. I would say go into it with low expectations just to have a good time, and you would have a good time. I wouldn't necessarily say it's twisty and turny. I was just blown away by the mystery and those twists and turns. Even though I predicted the ending, I'll just say I had suspicions throughout the whole thing that something wasn't quite right. I still enjoyed this book, even though I would say it was pretty predictable.
I couldn't even if I tried it. All I hear is this voice inside of me, but I do my best to hide it. And I pray that it is temporarily. I've been lost for so long, but you make me feel that I am on something true, something real.
The next book, which is probably the biggest fantasy book that I have on this list, it is Valor by John Gwynne. This is book 2 in the Faithful and the Fallen series. The first book is Malice. This book was 5 stars for me. I absolutely loved this book. Book 1 was also 5 stars. I just love John Gwynne's writing style. It's absolutely everything that I love about fantasy books, about a fantasy world, and just the way that John Gwynne constructs His World is a masterpiece. While I won't give you guys the rundown of book 2, I'll briefly talk about Malice, which is book 1. Book 1 follows a whole cast of characters. It's essentially a story about battle between good versus evil. In book 1, you don't really know what side is good and what side is bad. A long time ago, there was this god war that obliterated the Banished Lands. It was prophesized then that many hundreds of years in the future, the same battle would happen again. Book 1, not this one, but book 1 is the very beginnings of that prophesized god war happening again. We follow a huge cast of characters in both of these two books. Some are the same, some are different for certain reasons, but I think John Gwynne truly has an art for crafting characters that just make you feel like these are like real people. He has created characters that you care about deeply. With whatever happens to them, you literally feel your heart shatter, or when they hit certain triumphs and there are certain things that they do and you're just rooting for them. He truly makes you care about these people, these characters. I think John Gwynne does an absolutely phenomenal job of crafting these types of characters. There are quite a few thrillers on this list. I don't think I was prepared for the number of thrillers I was going to be talking about in this vlog, but I'm not upset about it because I love thrillers. The next one up is The Stranger Upstairs by Lisa M. Matlin. This book follows our main character, Sarah Slade, and it says, most people wouldn't buy an infamous murder house to renovate for fun, but Sarah Slade is not most people. This book is pretty wild. So this book follows our main character, Sarah Slade. Her and her husband bought this infamous murder house where back in the 1980s, I believe, it was a murder-suicide, and his daughter ended up running down the street saying, don't kill me, don't kill me, don't kill me, and nobody ever saw his daughter again. And this house remained pretty much abandoned the whole time. I did give this book 4 stars, mainly because that twist at the end, it was fine and I could see how we got to that ending. I don't want to say I was disappointed, it just probably wasn't really the ending I was expecting. But this book does stick with me. I think my main issue with this book, I just got disappointed and it felt a smidge longer than it needed to be. There were certain parts in the story that just lagged and I was just a little bit bored. With that being said, there were certain parts of this book that were very creepy, that were very eerie, and I feel like the author did an awesome job with the details of explaining really creepy moments because I was a little scared from time to time, and I think if some of those weaker parts would have been tightened up or maybe just taken out of the story in general, I think it could have been a really scary book. Just scary and creepy and just weird. It's just those few points where I felt like the book struggled a little bit. If those points had been kind of tightened up, it would have been a lot more enjoyable. But I still gave it a 4 star because I still think about this book. I'll absolutely never forget. I was folding laundry and I was listening to the audiobook at one point and I had my back to the door. My boyfriend came in and I didn't know he had come in, and I had turned and he was standing there. He's 6'3", and I about had a stroke because of the part I was at in this book, and with him standing there in the doorway, it was an event. I will say, you know, this book definitely gave me emotions, but I think it was just a 4-star read for me. I don't know if I would pick up another book by this author. I really don't know. Like, I could see myself just going the rest of my life, never picking up another book by this author and not really thinking twice about it. But if they did publish something and I thought that I would be interested in it, I might give it a shot. It's just one of those where I teeter on that edge where I'm like, I could or I couldn't. It's kind of like a no harm, no foul type situation. The last book on this list before I start talking about my DNFs is Beasts of Prey by Anaya Gray. I love the cover of this book. I also love that this author is another Georgia girl. I absolutely loved this book. It was told in 3 perspectives, and each perspective had a different audiobook narrator, and I loved that. I think the audiobook for this was 5 stars. I mean, the entire book itself was 5 stars too. This was brilliant. The synopsis says, Locosa was once a city of magic and splendor. Now, 100 years after the rupture scarred the sky and devastated the land, land and its people, magic is no more than a myth until one night when Kofi, an endangered beast keeper at the infamous Night Zoo, unexpectedly unleashes a dangerous, untamed power that has been secretly brewing within her for years. She sets into motion a chilling sequence of events that not only upends her entire world, but also links her to a complicated stranger with secrets of his own. As a warrior in training of the elite Sons of the Six, Ekon's task is to stop Kofi in her attempt to flee the Night Zoo. Instead, she saves him from the Shatani, a monster that has plagued Lakosa for nearly a century and stalked Ekon's nightmares. Following their chance encounter with the beast, Kofi and Ekon, each with a hidden agenda, strike a tentative bargain, teaming up to capture the Shatani as a hoped-for solution to their dire situations. To do so, they must enter the greater jungle, a world steeped in wild, frightening magic and untold dangers. But once the hunt begins, it quickly becomes unclear whether they are the hunters or the hunted. I loved this book, and it's the start of a trilogy, and the trilogy is finished. This author has so much potential. This is her debut, but her writing style is absolutely beautiful. While I listened to the audiobook a lot of the times, I want to say that I think that this author does a really great job with distinguishing her characters and the characters' voices. We get our main characters, Kofi and Ekon, and there's another POV, and I don't want to spoil anything for you. But this author just does an absolutely awesome job with transitioning between those three voices. And I really love how the author structured it. So there was a twist in this book with that third POV, and I had my suspicions as to who this person was and what the author was trying to do. I predicted and I had my suspicions with that, and then it was later revealed that that was correct. It definitely didn't take away my experience with this story. Honestly, it was a nice little, I don't want to say mystery, but it was a nice little extra added layer to this book that kept me really engaged with it. This is young adult, and I was a little nervous about reading a young adult, especially characters who are younger. I believe our characters were 16 in this, and it made me a little nervous because sometimes these characters can read very young. Sometimes I just don't jive with that. But this author did so well with making the dialogue mature, not super cringy, not super cheesy. There were some cutesy little parts in here that I liked. You can also tell that this author did an extensive amount of research on African mythology and folklore, and I think that's what makes this book so beautiful and so unique. Is a lot of these stories and a lot of what goes on in this book is based off of African mythology and folklore. It's really a breath of fresh air. I have hopes of buying the other two books, finishing this series hopefully soon.
Left behind back at the station. Suddenly there's no one else but me around. Lost my thought in translation. Oh, if I could only bring this back around.
This section is probably going to go by pretty quickly because I DNF'd these three books that we're about to talk about. The first book I'm going to mention is definitely a hard DNF. I just don't see myself returning to this book ever. So this book that I am talking about is Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan. I am just as upset about this as you are. The synopsis for this book says, growing up on the moon, Xingyin is accustomed to solitude, unaware that she's being hidden away from a powerful celestial emperor who exiled her mother for stealing his elixir of immortality. But when Xingyin's magic flares and her existence is discovered, she is forced to flee her home, leaving her mother behind. Alone, untrained, and unafraid, she makes her way to the celestial kingdom, a land of wonder and secret. Disguising her identity, she seizes an opportunity to learn alongside the crown prince, mastering archery and magic, even as passion flames between her and the emperor's son. To save her mother, Xingyin embarks on a perilous quest, confronting legendary creatures and vicious enemies across the earth and sky. When treachery looms and forbidden magic threatens threatens the kingdom. However, she must challenge the ruthless celestial emperor for her dream, striking a dangerous bargain in which she is torn between losing all she loves or plunging into the realms of chaos. I was obsessed with this story for the first 30%. I absolutely loved the writing. I loved when our main character on the moon, her relationship with her mother, and I loved everything about that. I even loved when one of the family friends had to help to get her away and then they were getting chased in the sky. I loved all of that. Once she started learning beside the crown prince and they were going through all of their classes, it felt juvenile. I don't know if it was me or if it was something to do with the writing in the story. I just lost interest in the story and I hate it. I was so in love with this story. I just knew it was going to be a 5-star read. I loved this first half of the book so much. I had already requested book 2 from the library. It was being delivered the day I decided to stop reading this book. I ended up returning book 1 to the library right after I got the text message saying book 2 was there. I wasn't enjoying it as much as I thought I was going to. Just don't see myself returning back to this story. The training sequence in the story was too long. I don't know. It felt too long. It felt a little too juvenile for my taste, considering how action-packed the first half of this story was. Her being up on the moon, us learning that she has to be in secret, with everything that happens after that, and then her being dropped from the sky. I loved all of that. And I loved how fast-paced it was. For it to stop and for me to just feel like I slammed into a brick wall and then nothing was happening, I was so disappointed that I didn't want to continue with this story. The next book on this list is going to be a soft DNF because it had nothing to do with the book itself. I hate that I'm saying this because I know they work so incredibly hard, but I just did not care for the audiobook narrator for this book. I had to stop reading this book because of the audiobook narrator. There was something about his voice that was putting me into a reading slump, and I can't quite pinpoint what it was about his voice. I didn't like it. It's a nonfiction read, but it's The Wager by David Gran. I really want to get back to this. Like I said, it's a soft DNF, and I do think it's because of the audiobook narrator. I don't have plans to pick it up really anytime soon. That audiobook narrator really did a number on me. My last soft DNF. When I say soft, I truly mean that this is a soft DNF. And it is The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex E. Harrow. Because this is your favorite book, let me explain myself. My camera battery's about to die. Hang on. Okay, so let me explain. It is a complete me problem. I am the problem with this book. But before I get into that, let me just quickly read you the synopsis. As a ward of the wealthy Mr. Locke, January Scalar feels a little different from the artifacts that decorate his sprawling mansion, carefully maintained, largely ignored, and utterly out of place. When she finds a strange book, one that tells a tale of secret doors of love, adventure, and danger, for the first time, January realizes she can escape her story and sneak into somebody else's. This story is a historical fiction. When I had access to the audiobook through the Libby app, I was not in the mood to read a historical fiction. I tried to read it and it put me into a reading slump. So I had to stop reading this book. It was in the middle of the summer when I attempted to read this book. It wasn't it. This was not what I wanted. I didn't want to read this book at that time. I think when I went into this book, I wasn't completely aware that it was going to be a historical fiction or how much of like historical context was going to be in the story. And at the time, I just wasn't interested. I didn't want to read it. I soft DNF'd it because my friend actually gave me this book and I want to give the story its own fair shot and I'm feeling the spark to read historical fiction. I'm weird about my historical fiction. I really have to be in the mood to read a historical fiction and I cannot read more than one historical fiction back to back. I don't know why. That's just something weird with me. I'm pretty upset that I had to DNF this book, but I really want to give this book and this author a fair shot. I have read The Once and Future Witches by the same author and I loved it so much. I just don't think I was in the right headspace to pick up this story at that particular time that I tried to read it. So it's a soft DNF, which is a pretty big bummer because this was one of the 24 and 24 I wanted to read. I just don't see myself even picking this book up by the end of the year. And that is going to be it for this video, everyone. I want to thank you so much for watching. If you read any of the books that I talked about in this video, let me know down in the comments below. Let me know what you're currently reading. If you want to Tell me a book you also recently DNF'd. Let me know down in the comments below. If you're still watching and you don't know what else to say, leave me a little cleaning emoji down below in the comments. There might be a little vacuum, a little duster. If there's none of that stuff, just leave me a window pane. How about that? Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.